In the piece Bloggers Without Borders by Riverbend, the author, using a pseudonym, ends up showing us all sorts of the nightmarish nature of being a refugee, having to go through and deal with the tremendous bureaucracy that sometimes that can be attached to, and her own sort of personal revelation that she herself is a refugee, despite the fact that her circumstance is significantly different from the images of refugees that we often see depicted in the media. One thing that's interesting right off the bat is the fact that this author uses a pseudonym. That means a name that is other than her real name. She uses the name Riverbend to conceal her identity because she, in fact, is an Iraqi refugee who has moved to Syria in an effort to escape the war-torn nature of her own country. Some things that are interesting in this piece are just how she gets into that idea of what a shock it is to have to leave home, to have to try to start anew in a whole different place. She says, "The first weeks here were something of a culture shock. It has taken me these last 3 months to work away certain habits I'd acquired in Iraq after the war. It's funny how you learn to act a certain way and don't even know you're doing strange things, like avoiding people's eyes in the street or crazily murmuring prayers to yourself when stuck in traffic. It took me at least 3 weeks to teach myself to walk properly again with head lifted, not constantly looking behind me." These sort of emotional details that she gives. It's not just the fact that she's depicting something or showing you a certain thing. It's the fact that she's using emotion and trying to connect you to the situation that are what make the description here work more fully. She gets you into that idea of her own personal struggle to overcome. After that, in the piece, she really dives deep into the ceaseless nightmare that is bureaucracy and immigration, because Syria had tried to limit the amount of Iraqis who were pouring into the country. They made it more difficult to stay and made you had to go through certain visa processes, which meant that the bureaucracy of it was really deep and was going to lead to our narrator having to go back to the border and re-enter just so that she could get a refreshed stamp on her passport, which is the exact symbol of something that is purely bureaucratic. There's no purpose whatsoever for her to have to go back and cross the border again other than the bureaucracy of having to get her passport stamped to extend her stay. So she goes into a lot of detail about that, a lot of detail about the struggle of just having to wait in line and having to deal with this. It took 4 hours to leave the Syrian border, after which came the lines of the Iraqi border post. Those were even longer. So can you imagine, going to an amusement park to ride the roller coaster and having to wait in line, except you're waiting in line for multiple times as long, and instead of getting to ride a roller coaster, you're just getting to stay in a place that's not war-torn. That's an awful lot of struggle. She also goes into other description and taps into that emotion. The sun beat down on everyone equally, Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds alike, thus demonstrating the fact that despite the fact that Iraq is torn by war and ripped apart and people are at each other's throats, that here in this type of circumstance with people who have been sort of booted out of their own home, that they're all being shone on by the same sun as they all wait in line together to try to find a better life. She also goes into a lot of descriptions saying, "The Syrian immigration man, sifting through dozens of passports, called out names and looked at faces as he handed over the passports patiently. 'Stand back, please, stand back.' There was a general cry towards the back of the crowded hall where we were standing as someone collapsed. As they lifted him, I recognized an old man who was there with his family, being chaperoned by his sons, leaning on a walking stick." So she gives you things to see, things to depict. She doesn't just say it was hot and miserable. She shows us a man who's collapsing. After this in the piece, it closes really sort of interestingly with this idea and discussion of refugees and what refugees are. She herself had never really identified as a refugee because she's not living in a tent in some refugee camp. She's a relatively affluent individual in comparison who was able to leave the country and try to start a new life elsewhere. But despite this, she is a refugee. She is somebody who has been sort of exiled from her own location, brought away from her own home because of war, and now no longer really has a place to live. And it's through this sort of emotional connection that she ends up getting the readers to see in life as she sees it.